She married the most beautiful man in Hollywood. He married the toughest woman in the business. And for 12 years, the entire world believed it was a fairy tale. It wasn't, not even close. If you think you know the story of Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor, stay with me, because what actually happened behind the doors of that marriage is stranger, sadder, and far more complicated than any studio press release ever let on. This is the untold romance of two of old Hollywood's biggest stars, and the secrets they carried until the day they died. Let's start with who they actually were before they met, because that's where this whole story begins to make sense. Barbara Stanwyck was not built by Hollywood. She built herself. Orphaned young, raised by an older sister, dancing in chorus lines by her teens, she clawed her way into pictures with nothing but grit and talent. By the time she reached her 30s, she was already one of the highest-paid women in America. She didn't need saving. She didn't need rescuing. She needed, if anything, someone who could keep up with her. And before Robert Taylor ever entered the picture, Barbara had already survived a marriage that nearly broke her. Her first husband was older, controlling, and by most accounts deeply threatened by her rising success. That marriage taught her something she never forgot. Love in this industry could be just as dangerous as ambition. She learned early that in this industry, vulnerability could be used against you, and she carried that lesson into every relationship she ever had afterward. Professional or personal, Robert Taylor was the opposite kind of star. Discovered almost by accident, blessed with a face MGM built entire advertising campaigns around, he became the studio's answer to a leading man audiences could fall in love with instantly. He was younger than Barbara, softer, in some ways, less battle-tested. And when these two met on a film set in the mid-1930s, nobody expected what came next. Here's where it gets interesting. Robert fell for Barbara almost immediately. She was older, more experienced, sharper-tongued, and utterly unimpressed by his boyish charm. That, ironically, is exactly what pulled him in. But Barbara hesitated. She wasn't in a hurry to hand her life over to anyone else, especially not to a man 7 years her junior who half of America was already swooning over. So what changed her mind? This is the part the old magazines never explained properly. It wasn't romance in the way we imagine it. It was pressure. Real, calculated, studio-manufactured pressure. MGM did not want its golden boy linked to rumors swirling around his personal life. A wedding to a respected, older, incredibly talented actress was, in the eyes of the studio, the perfect solution. Convenient, clean, good for box office. Good for reputation. Does that mean there was no love there? Not necessarily. But it does mean the marriage began with far more strategy than the fan magazines ever admitted. They married in 1939, in a quiet ceremony designed to look spontaneous but was, in truth, anything but. The press ate it up instantly. The gorgeous young leading man and the brilliant, no-nonsense actress. Hollywood's golden couple. And for years, that image held. Fan magazines ran feature after feature about their supposedly perfect domestic life. Photographers were invited into their home for staged breakfasts and staged dinners. Every image sold the same story. Two impossibly attractive people who had found lasting love in an industry famous for destroying it. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Barbara ran the household with the same discipline she brought to every film set. Friends described their home as orderly, almost military in its structure. Robert, meanwhile, was often away for months at a time, shooting overseas, socializing with co-stars, living a life increasingly separate from the one splashed across magazine covers. And then came the rumors. The kind that never officially existed but that everyone in town seemed to somehow know about anyway. Whispers about affairs. Whispers about long absences that weren't just about work. Whispers, too, about Barbara's own private life, rumors that trailed her for decades and that she never once addressed publicly. Not to confirm, not to deny, not ever. Why does that matter? Because it tells you something crucial about who Barbara Stanwyck really was. She did not perform her private life for anyone. Not for fans. Not for reporters. Not even, it seems, entirely for her own husband. So here's the real question this story keeps circling back to. Were they ever truly, deeply in love? Or were they two enormously talented, enormously guarded people who built a partnership that looked like love from the outside because that's what the moment required? The truth may be somewhere in that uncomfortable middle ground. Let's talk about something the tabloids of the era barely touched, because it says more about this marriage than any headline ever did. Barbara and Robert rarely worked together on screen. Think about that. Two of the biggest names in the business, married for over a decade, and Hollywood almost never paired them in the same film. Some historians believe the studios kept them apart deliberately, worried that seeing the couple together on screen would somehow break the illusion audiences had built around them in their heads. Others believe it was simpler than that. Barbara and Robert were each too valuable, too bankable, on their own to risk sharing a marquee. Whatever the reason, it meant something quietly telling. Their real relationship and their public image existed almost entirely in separate lanes. Audiences saw the wedding photos, the interviews, the carefully staged home life. What they never saw was the two of them actually working side by side, creating something together the way true partners often do. As the years passed, cracks that had always been there simply widened. World War II pulled Robert into military service as a flight instructor, and the distance, both physical and emotional, only grew. Letters between them grew shorter. Visits grew rarer. And when he came back, something had shifted. Colleagues who worked with the couple in the years after the war described a relationship that had cooled into something closer to formality than passion. Barbara, meanwhile, kept working at the same relentless pace she always had, throwing herself into film after film, as if staying busy was the only way she knew how to keep from confronting what was slipping away at home. By the late 1940s, the cracks were impossible to hide, even from the public that had once adored their romance. Divorce rumors began leaking into the same magazines that once celebrated their wedding. Reporters who once wrote glowing profiles now hinted, carefully, that all was not well in Hollywood's golden household. And in 1951, after 12 years of marriage, Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor finally, quietly, ended it. Here's what almost nobody talks about, though. Barbara was reportedly devastated, not because the marriage had been some perfect, unbroken love story, but because divorce, for her, echoed something far older and far more painful. She had already lost people. She had already been abandoned once before, as a child, and then again in her first marriage. Losing Robert, even a Robert she had grown distant from, reopened something she had spent her whole adult life trying to seal shut. She never remarried. Think about that for a second. One of the most powerful, successful, admired women in Hollywood history. And she chose, for the rest of her long life, to remain alone rather than risk that kind of loss again. Robert, on the other hand, moved forward. He remarried fairly quickly, started a family, and seemed, at least publicly, to settle into a quieter version of stardom in his later years, gravitating toward television work as the studio system that made him famous slowly collapsed around him. But here's the twist almost nobody expects. Despite the divorce, despite the distance, despite everything that had gone wrong between them, Barbara Stanwyck reportedly never stopped caring for Robert Taylor. Those who knew her said she followed his career quietly from a distance for the rest of her life, never commenting publicly, never revisiting the past in interviews, but never fully letting go of it either. When he became seriously ill decades later, those close to her said she was deeply shaken. And when he passed away in 1969, friends said something in Barbara changed permanently. The woman who never showed cracks in public showed one then. She reportedly kept a photograph from their years together for the rest of her life, tucked away, never explained, never discussed. So, what do we actually take away from all of this? Maybe it's this. Hollywood loves to sell us perfect love stories, golden couples, fairy tale weddings under studio lights. But real relationships, even the ones dressed up in glamour and headlines, are messier than the myth. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor were not a fairy tale. They were two complicated, guarded, Deeply private people who built something real, let it fracture under pressure neither of them fully controlled, and carried the weight of that fracture for the rest of their lives. Maybe that's actually more romantic than the myth ever was. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. Barbara Stanwyck went on to become one of the most respected actresses in American history, admired for decades for a work ethic that never once wavered. Even as her personal life remained locked behind a door she refused to open for anyone. And in many ways, that silence has become part of the legend itself, a mystery that historians and fans are still trying to piece together, decades after both of them are gone.